comparing the monthly cost of a mortgage payment to the monthly cost of rent. A mortgage payment is not the cost of living in a home. I hope that will become clear as we proceed through the video. Homes are generally terrible investments, yet a lot of people believe that they could not have found a better investment. One reason is salience bias, the tendency to focus on information that stands out, whether due to its prominence, emotional impact, or vividness, often at the expense of other less noticeable or less emotionally charged details. Buying a home is a big emotionally charged purchase, and the final price is likely the result of emotional negotiations with a seller. The same goes for selling a home. This leads people to focus on those two numbers, how much they bought the home for and how much they sold it for. If you bought a home for $40,000 in 1974, did some upsizing, and eventually sold for $2 million in 2024, you would probably feel pretty good about the decision. But there are two big problems with this evaluation. One is that compounding is hard to think about. 50 years is a long time. The compound average growth rate to get from $40,000 to $2 million over this period is 8.2%. Don't get me wrong, that is a great return. This example does come from Vancouver after all, and from a comment on the internet from an anonymous person arguing that owning a home is great. I did find an example of a home in Vancouver that listed for $51,900 in 1974 and sold for $1.65 million in 2024. That lowers the compound growth rate to 7.16%. Still great, but here's some context. Over that period, the MSCI World Index, an index representing the global stock market, returned 10.2% annualized in Canadian dollars, and the TSX, an index representing the Canadian stock market, returned 9.44%. Clearly, homes are not the only way to compound wealth, even in a market like Vancouver. It is important to reiterate that Vancouver is an extreme example. The returns to housing in Canada and around the world are generally lower. The price return on housing Canada-wide from 1974 through 2024 was 6% before inflation, and inflation ran at 3.76% annualized over that period, meaning a real housing return of a little over 2%. Data from around the world going as far back as 1870 show inflation-adjusted returns to owned homes as a little over 1 percentage point on average, while stocks have outpaced inflation by about 5 percentage points. The economic reality is that homeowners bear the cost of having their money invested in a lower expected return home rather than higher expected return stocks. This is called an opportunity cost. To be conservative, I think 3% is a reasonable figure to use as the opportunity cost of having money invested in a home rather than in stocks. The other issue is that the salience bias hides the total costs of owning a home. If you buy a house for $51,900 and then sell it for $1.65 million many years later, your return on that asset is not the 7.16% compound growth rate. The reason is simple. Owning a home costs a lot of money. Between regular maintenance spending to keep the house running, spending to make up for depreciation of the building like the roof deteriorating, renovation spending to improve and update the home, which many people do, and property taxes, it's not uncommon for people to spend 2 to 3% of the home value per year on average just to live there. A good example is that 1974 listing that I found. It was completely rebuilt in 2012 before selling for $1.65 million in 2024. The rundown 1974 structure would be unlikely to have sold for the same price. Homes are depreciating assets. People get really upset when I say that, but it's true. Land appreciates. Homes, buildings degrade and decline until in many cases being torn down and rebuilt. Those depreciation, maintenance, and renovation costs need to be included in the calculation of the return on the home. People that disagree with that 2 to 3% per year number have probably never owned a home. But I didn't just make that number up either. Academic research and data from Statistics Canada support figures in that range. I'll link sources in the episode description. For one example, in National Accounts data, Statistics Canada reports average maintenance and repair costs of 0.81% as a proportion of net residential housing stock over the last 50 years, and renovation spending at 2.35%. This implies that there is more than a 3% average annual contribution to the average increases in home values that can be attributed to costs incurred by homeowners. Even if we take the lower end, 2%, removing that from 7.16% results in a return of 5.16% for this Vancouver home. There are, of course, costs to invest in stocks too, but they're typically much lower than 2 to 3% per year as long as you're not investing in the highest fee actively managed mutual funds or segregated funds. Renters do also need to cover their housing costs since you can't live in your tax-free savings account. The interesting thing here is that when you add up all the costs of living in an owned home, the ongoing maintenance, depreciation, renovation costs, property taxes, and the opportunity cost of investing in a home rather than stocks, you typically end up in a number pretty close to what you would pay in rent. Take 2% in estimated ongoing costs and a 3% opportunity cost for having money in a home rather than in stocks. That is 5%. With these numbers, theoretically, rent should cost around 5% of the value of a home. If either renting or owning were materially more expensive overall, it would be reasonable to expect people to shift between the two options until their costs converge. If rent is cheap, more people will switch to renting, up until the point where rent stops being cheap. The interesting thing is that this ends up being a pretty good model for rents in Canada. The national average price for buying an apartment in Canada in March 2025 was $512,300. Multiplied by 5% and divided by 12 to get a monthly number, we get $2,134 as the implicit cost of owning the average apartment in Canada. The national average rent for apartments is $2,119, almost identical to what must have come out of your parents. This means that in this example, you are approximately financially indifferent between renting and owning the average apartment in Canada. The math doesn't always work out like this, but this thinking lets you gauge whether owning or renting is relatively cheap or expensive. For a long-term perspective, including the effects of mortgage debt, which I'll come back to shortly, you can use the free rent versus wealth calculator on PWR Capital's website to see that long-term wealth outcomes in this case are comparative. I'll link this example preloaded with these values in the video description so that you can play with them. I used national average data here, but you can plug in numbers for your specific city to compare projected outcomes. In some cases, rent might look cheap, and in some cases, it might look expensive. I should say a few words about how this model works. It is comparing the long-term outcome of buying a home to the counterfactual outcome of renting. In the first year of the model, the owner buys a home. They pay a down payment and closing costs. The renter instead invests the down payment and closing costs in a portfolio of stocks and then pays rent, which increases 1% per year above inflation in the model. The total cash flow costs of owning a home, including property taxes, maintenance costs, and mortgage payments, are assumed to be the total cash flows available to both the renter and owner. If rent costs less than the owner's cash flow costs, the renter is saving and investing the difference into a portfolio of stocks. If rent costs more than the cash flow costs of owning, a common scenario with the mortgage paid off, the renter funds the cash flow shortfall from their portfolio. This scenario assumes that the renter is investing in their RSP, TFSA, and FHSA, which are not taxable, but I will come back to the implications of taxable investing later. To come back to the main points on home ownership not being such a great investment, salience bias leads people to focus on what they bought their home for and what they sold for, ignoring the ongoing costs of living in the home, and especially at long horizons, overestimating the compound returns of their home. Properly accounted for, the returns to housing are typically not special, and similar financial outcomes can be achieved by renting and investing in stocks. There are multiple academic studies based on Canadian and US data showing this to be true. Let's move on to the value of mortgage debt. I'll come back to forced savings and tax treatment later. Mortgage financing is one of the most favorable forms of financing available to most people. It is generally low cost and does not get called when the home value drops like a margin loan for stocks can. Borrowing early in life to get exposure to assets is arguably a good thing, and mortgage debt is a great way to do it. It's also a double-edged sword. Many people in Canada were squeezed financially when mortgage rates increased after the pandemic, and they can be a burden if your property value declines and you want to move. The main point I want to make here, though, is that a mortgage is not a silver bullet for owners to build more wealth than renters. Take an example where a home is bought in cash by a homeowner. The counterfactual renter invests the cost of buying the home, in this case the full price of the home plus closing costs, in stocks, and then pays rent. The owner doesn't have a mortgage, but they do still have some costs like maintenance costs and property tax. But their cash flow costs are much lower than the renters, meaning the renter in the model has to draw from their portfolio to cover the difference. The thing is, the expected returns on the renter's investment portfolio are more than enough to make up for the difference. The owner is paying a large implicit cost by having so much home equity relative to the renter's large stock portfolio. After 50 years, the renter's wealth exceeds the owner's by $2.2 million. Next, consider the same case, but instead of paying in cash, the owner puts down a 20% down payment and finances the remainder of the purchase with a mortgage. Now, the owner has large cash flow costs because in addition to property taxes and maintenance, they have a mortgage payment. The renter initially invests the smaller down payment into a stock portfolio and then saves the monthly difference between the owner's higher ongoing cash flow costs and their rent into an investment portfolio. The net worth difference after 50 years in this case is $467,000. Financing with a mortgage was more financially advantageous for the owner than paying cash, but the renter was still able to come out ahead without borrowing any money. The owner's relatively high cash flow costs allowed the renter to save more into their higher expected return portfolio, all else equal. The next misunderstanding I want to cover is that people who own homes are wealthy because they own homes. It is true that the average net worth of a homeowner is significantly higher than that of a renter, both in Canada and the United States. But this is not because owning a home is an automatic path to wealth. Renters tend to be younger, have lower incomes, and spend more of their incomes on housing costs, making building wealth by any means more of a challenge. Buying a home would not solve these problems, and some research shows that homeownership could actually negatively impact the happiness of low-income households due to the financial burden of homeownership. A 2017 paper, A Revision of the American Dream of Homeownership, seeks to answer the question of why owner households tend to be wealthier than renters. The authors find that it can be attributed to choices within the scope of the individual, like how much the renter saves, rather than through the impact of exogenous market variables like housing or stock market returns. They show that households that fail to reinvest the cash flow difference between renting
My name is Tim Grant. I'm the president of PCI Developments. We're a local developer, investor, manager in conjunction with our affiliate, Definitely. We've been around for 44 years. A good portion of our history through building a lot of rental housing. Up until the early 2000s, it was virtually impossible in our market with condo being the primary form of housing. Kind of just after the Olympics, I think there was an increasing recognition of the need for rental housing, and in our view, the opportunity for rental housing is relatively immature sector. And so that, in conjunction with municipalities starting to offer bonus density relative to condo, and it started to become something.
デイトリッパーとスリルを求める皆さん、まもなく私のお気に入りの場所に出かけるわよ。南阿波の美しい景色の道路を走りながら山々の眺めを味わいましょう。楽しんでね。最後に車両確認ができたら出発するわよ。最初に一つお願い。できるだけ一緒に行動してね。これはグループでの活動だから。気に行きすぎないで。それと景色もちゃんと楽しんで。右手のずっと遠くに見えるのがバーキャンシティよ。元は小さな町で江戸と呼ばれる小さな漁村から始まったの。交易とインフラが発展するにつれて町の範囲も大きくなって今のような姿になったのよ。広大で光り輝く日本の首都にね。私たちかっこよくない？今回のデートリップのマシンはどこに行っても注目の的ね。走りを突き詰めて作られた今一番乗りたいモダンなスーパーカーなんだから。さあ、ほとんどのみんながホライズンフェスティバルのことは聞いたことがあると思うけど、今回のは特別よ。私 私自身が手紙を書いてメールを送って電書ボタンで飛ばしたの。フェスティバルの役員にホライズンを日本で開催してって聞き入れてくれた。ほら見て、ホライズンは誰でも参加できるわけじゃないわ。参加するには招待イベントで資格を取る必要があるの。ハイペースな A から B へのレースで複数のスタート地点があって見応え十分よ。そこで合格すればおめでとう。黄色のリストバンドをもらえるわ。これがあれば最初にいくつかのホライズンの公式イベントに参加できるようになる。この森の道を進んでいきながら周りの景色を眺めてね。豊かな生態系があって
我多邻国刚学这个词 ，Pesky。
写真を撮るのを忘れずにね。思い出を作っていくのよ。ここの道は細心の注意を払ってね。少し狭い上に急カーブがいくつか待ってるから。昼間の車がなくなった空っぽの道路を求めて深夜に出てくる人たちは典型的な JDM に乗って限界に挑戦したいっていうの。その理由がみんなにもわかるはずよ。だけど今回はそういうことをしに来たんじゃないわ。この道を何回も通ってるけどここに来るたびに鳥肌が立つわ。さあみんなあの景色をご覧あれ。高価になった道路のスリルを感じるのよ。ここを越えていくのが好きな理由のもう一つを見せてあげる。さあトンネルよ。風景の間を切って進み急な坂の地形に伸びる曲がりくねった道路を手助けしてくれるわ。うちのメンバーの一人は幸運にもアウディ R8 に乗ってるの。デイトリップじゃなく単一走行ならこの V10 のスーパーカーは時速200マイルまで出せるわ。レースターの DNA のおかげでどんなコーナーにも挑める安定性とレスポンスがあるわ。壮大な景色って約束したでしょ。見て富士山。活火山で最後の噴火は1707年よ。溶岩や火山灰スコリアの幾層もの堆積でできた富士山は標高3776メートル。ほぼ対称のシルエットで私たちの頭上にそびえ立つの。では時代の名前にもなってるの。そう、江戸時代。成長、文化、安定と繁栄の時代。1603年から1868年。その時代にここ奈良井宿は中山道で最も栄えた宿場町だったの。あ、中山道って江戸、今の東京シティへ続く街道のことね。
よしメイ、いいね。じゃあデイトリッパーの皆さん、またすぐにパート2で会おうぜ。よければすぐ向かうぜ。俺たち3人は途中のスピードゾーンに寄っていこうか。よし、スピードゾーンについて知ってるか。そこではスピードを上げて進む。超高速で進め。このシェラが間違いないはずだ。できるか。
もちろんできる。
这有点难吧？我靠，这个地方啊！我靠，这个地方，哎，这个地方最烦人了，我靠！啊！ 这地方最难吧？我靠！哈，经典。居然还不让存。很难啊！还是老老实实过去算了，我真无语。
ありがとうジョーダン、楽しかったわ。あなたのチャレンジすごくいいわね。
どうしてお前のデイトリップに付き合ってると思うんだ？
その言い回しは間違ってるけど、言いたいことはわかるわ。いつもありがとうジョーディ。大した度胸ね。私ですら攻めるのが怖いコーナーだってあるのに。そうね、このデイトリップはまだ終わりじゃないわ。ここはハイペースだけど景色は抜群よ。 綺麗で伝統的な景色を楽しみながら松見大橋を進むわ。じゃあ行こうか。
这么多车。
みんな、このデイトリップのセクションは少し速くなるわよ。植物が少なく白い雪に覆われた荒野は春になれば活気にあふれて花が咲き乱れる。日本の風景は四季に応じて大きく変化するからどの季節も素敵な景色が見られる。私は富士山に登ったことがあるの。エクスペディションでね。12時間の過酷な長旅だったわ。日本のことわざに一度も登らぬバカ二度登るバカってあるけどまさにその通り。今でも足が痛いくらい。でも景色は一度は登るべきよ。次に出てくる車はレーストラックで見たことがあるはずのものだけど今回はレースじゃなくてガイドツアーだからね。準備した豆知識を全部読んであげる時間も必要だし、この先はトリッキーなコーナーがあるよ。速度を落として。
还顶我！
まるで超高速で大自然に浸れるような美しいドライブコースで運転手のドライビングスキルが真に試されるものなのよ。忘れないうちに言っておくけどこれは運転していて最高に楽しい道路よ。蛇行しジグザグに進む道は限界に挑戦するドライバーを試すことになる。この地域の多くの道路と同じようにこの道路も広大な森林を通り抜けて作られた。ほとんどの木は根を保護する技術を利用して移植されている。だから破壊するんじゃなくってただ単に場所を移していくの。日本は緑地を大切にしてて移植ができない時は新しく植え直すのが一般的なのよ。一緒に走ってるノータスエキシージカップ430に注目して。カーボンファイバー製ボディパネルとアルミ製エキゾーストで車重はたったの1トン強。英国メーカーの軽量かつアグレッシブなサーキットマシンよ。ノータスが簡素化させて軽さを足せといえばこのレース向けの野獣の出来上がりってわけ。よし、それじゃあみんなのためにもここはちょっと静かにしておくわね。この場所でやってのけるのが完璧なことはただ一つ、トップスピードを出すこと。さあアクセル全開よ。
刚说完就要减速。
右手にはまた違った景色が見えているわ。この先の左に伝統的な鳥居が見えるわ。鳥居は人の住む世界と神聖な領域の境界を示すものよ。ここの門は伝統的なやり方で木材と石材を使って作られたものでそれぞれが独自の芸術品となっているわ。
分を変えてみてこのデイトリップを栄光で終わらせるか。正しい答えははいジョー D だ。承諾には首を縦に大きく振ればいいぞ。さあそれではこれからスピードゾーンに向かうということは、
スピードゾーンのことはみんな知ってるわ。さあ行きましょう。
スピードゾーンのカメラに残像みたいに映りたいならものすごいスピードがいる。
这什么奇怪的事？宝石。
コンマ数秒を削ることを目的としたタイムアタックサーキット用のマシンだ。
这个和平鸟居是说香根那个和平鸟居吗？因为香根那个鸟居好像叫和平鸟居，我记得我去过，在湖边的，在海上的一个。这是香根那个吗？我去。
11だが最後までこだわって設計されている。これは猛烈な競争を繰り広げるタイムアタックカーで驚異的なラップタイムを記録するのに最適だぜ。
2人ともありがとう。私のデートリップを手伝ってくれて真面目な話とても助かったわ。
メイ、いつでもやるぜ。俺に何か面白いことをさせてくれるなら参加するよ。
了解。2人がいてくれると私も嬉しい。その対象がスピードを出すことなら文句なし。
哎，我走太远，他不给我算了。
ねえねえ、楽しんでもらえたかな。どんな名所を見れた？
もちろんさメイ。さて俺はイベントがあるんだ。じゃあまたな。
なかなかいい走りだったわね。でもまだ少し余裕があると思うけど。 水コーナーのミックスが最高でさ、おまけにこの景色完璧な道かもね。
他怎么冲那么快啊？我这鱼雷，还有我这超级大鱼雷，非常抱歉。我靠！
嗯。
聞いてみるわね。ごめん、ちょっと人混みが。結構あら、私のママと自撮りしてる。大丈夫そうね。また後でつなぐわ。それまではパルスの曲をどうぞ。
那是街头赛的封面和《狂野飙车9》的风格一样。地平线巨蟹，巨线这个词到底是什么？哇，这个雨夜效果还不错呢，雨夜的效果非常有感觉哦。Cargo。这张照片非常有动感。拍到 Steam 上又完蛋了。也看不见了。
デイトリップが始まるよ。キャビンに来て。そこで待ってるね。パレスからこの辺りのストリートレースシーンで敵なしの圧倒的な活躍を見せているというとあるドライバーに賛辞をお送りします。ホライズンの上級主催者として私にはフェスティバルの公式コンペティションでスキルを披露してもらえるようにあなたを招待する権限があります。ぜひ参加してください。彼？あのドライバーなの？すでにフェスティバルを圧倒してたんですね。さっきのことは忘れてください。
Prison Palace。Discover Japan。地平线能在中国做一个就好，浓缩版是吧？这迷你版日本和迷你版中国，因为迷你版澳大利亚、迷你版墨西哥、迷你版美国、迷你版英国。你说如果地平线做中国，应该选哪座城市呢？因为一般会选一座，像英国都没有选伦敦，英国选了爱丁堡，日本选的是东京，澳大利亚选的是哪儿啊？话说那是悉尼吗？还是布里斯班？还是黄金海岸吧？好像是，我也记不清。我觉得选重庆不错，朋友们。啊，上海的路和地形没有什么可选，北京也没有什么有意思。就是从开车的这个道路角度来说，就是重庆，因为它是个山城，会有很多坡道，应该会非常有意思。如果我来选的话，会选重庆。而且现在也很有名嘛，他们肯定一般选比较有名的城市。我说实话，现在国内除了北京、上海以外，可能最火的也不是可能，就应该最火的就是重庆，绝对。
走らせている車は激しい競争の時代にコースでもパドックでも戦いが必要だ。そしてモータースポーツを長年にわたって形作ってきたのは今日私たちが乗っているのはランボルギーニミューラ P400。自動車の歴史の流れを完全に変えた車で1966年に世界最速の量産車として誕生したわ。これがミッドエンジン後輪駆動レイアウトの高性能量産ロードカーを一般の人々が目にしたのが初めてだった
置引擎後
真の
轮
スポーツ
驱
カーにとってこれが究極のパフォーマンスカーの設計図であると考えられているわ。この先は積雪スキーリゾート、一年中雪に覆われているわ。スノーボード休暇にぴったり。それに思いっきりオフロードを走りたい時にもいいわよ。温かい飲み物を詰めたらあとは出発するだけね。これから訪れるのは今回の遠征の
大学，我还没有去过这地方。
雪の大谷よ。立山黒部アルペンベルトは厚い雪を切り開いて人工の雪の回廊を作る。積雪量によっては壁の高さが20メートルに届く時もあるのよ。もしくはフィートの方が分かりやすければ66フィートね。
你早说呀！他怎么不早点说呀？他每次都晚说，就比如说前面要转弯了，都倒弯了才说。
今回のツアーの最後にちょっとしたネタバレよ。上がったものはどうなる？そう、
優雅。
下がるしかないわよね。このゲレンデを滑ったことがある人も多いと思うけど、この場所は特別なの。みどりさんのリストバンドイベントを覚えているなら、彼女がそれを得たのはこのリゾート。ホライズンジャパンの歴史の一部で、今はその出発地点のすぐ近くにいるよ。この地域には怪物が住んでるって知ってた？そう、冗談抜きでね。スノーモンスター。はいはい、本物の怪物ではないけど、その見た目ってこと。ここではかなり大雪が降るから、木には冷たい風によって凍りついたふわふわな雪がかぶさることになるの。それを
哦，树冰啊，
まるで
藏王树冰。
のように見えるのよ。
我去过有一个地方有树冰，就是藏王那里，仙台附近，可能北海道之类的地方可能也有青森之类的地方，但是藏王是有的，叫雪怪。
いや、ここまでの山道を登る静かなドライブを楽しんだから、普段はスキー場として使われてるんだけど、今日は違う。今回のチャレンジだ。コースを滑り、そしてスライドしたらジャンプを決めろ。俺が判定する。頑張れ。じゃあスペシャルな走りを見せてくれよな。お前を下山させるにはランボがいいなって思ってるんだ。正直言って選択肢はブラカンステラートの一つに限られてるよな。オールテレンタイヤの標準装備見れば、この車が何をやりたがっているか一目でわかるだろ。
哎呦，哇，都是树冰，我操！开哪来了我这是？抵达前获得，他们一直没给我结算。刚才，如果我没有结算到终点了，是不是？
楽しんでくれた？見どころの多い地域だったでしょ？
ありがとうね、グッジョブ。
あなたも悪くなかったわ。じゃあまたね。
探索大师黄金纪念章。
すべての道を延々と走ってきたマスターエクスプローラーにふさわしい金色のスタンプね。
满了，日本探索已经满了。
掘り出し物の噂で持ちきりだよ。調べてみる価値はあると思うね。これは一番求められているタイプの物件ね。
观景房屋。
カメラが知ってることは全部俺が教えたんだぜ。要するに全部俺がやったってことさ。
探索大师。
おかえりなさい。デイトリップを続けよう。体を温めるために温かいものを飲めたらいいんだけど、このパートではクールなクラシックを。本物のモータリング遺産だ。さあ、もう説明はいらないよね。出発するよ。
那什么汽车总动员，它怎么长得像？那个雕像，我靠，长得真的就像汽车总动员里面的。Ford Escort。开始之前调声，那现在跟我说干什么？不对，这个也不能调吧？我忘了，好像可以调。头文字 D， 我还真没看，打算最近看。
クニクニしたファンを フォードエスコート RS1800 マーク2よ。1975年から1979年にかけて世界中のラリーを完全に支配していたの。1979年には世界で最も権威あるラリー競技で他のチームを寄せつけずさらなる栄光を手にしたの。よし、この区間はスピードを少し上げても大丈夫よ。長い直線とゆったりしたカーブを楽しんでね。長谷川ベイの電化リップに期待するのは2つ。極上の車、そして絶景ね。今あなたはすごい車を走らせているから、あとは景色を存分に楽しんで最高の体験を約束するから。
よし、古風で代表的なものを味わったな。それなら次は時代を進めてもっとモダンなものに触れてみようぜ。ボンネットの下での動きがより感じられるはずだぞ。
哇，这辆车长得好独特哎！哇，这改装的，我的天，这是啥呀？这改的完全不认识了，但它的用途是什么呢？看着非常的帅，不得不说。M Sport Fiesta。
そうさ、このモンスターを操りアクセル全開でランプにまっすぐ突っ込んで鮮やかに着地するんだ。
冗談言っておくけど、他のデイトリッパーのみんなにはこんな運転させないからね。
大丈夫、俺たちの仲間がこれくらい楽勝だって心配するな。
じゃ飛ばさないとね。市場で会おう。
今お前が乗っているのはエスコート MK2 以来40年ぶりの技術進歩を体現した1台だ。まずは前輪駆動 AWD からエコブースト搭載の 1.6 リットルターボで380馬力を叩き出す。路面に張り付くためのエアロも十分。まあお前なら飛ばしちゃうんだろうけど。
みんないつもありがとう。私のようにみんないつも楽しかったらいいんだけど。
ありがとうメイ、最高の時間だったよ。また会おう。
お世辞じゃなきゃいいけど。どうもありがとう。
328米。
正直俺でもあんなに飛んだことないよ。やったな。
我这也太豪宅了吧！这是什么神奇的房子？我靠！天哪，这是终极豪宅！
この家のバスルームにどんな設備があるのか知りたいの。
哇哇，150万！我靠！150万，直接把我钱给吃光了。但说实话，这房子样子有点怪啊，这个没有那么漂亮。豪华是豪华，房屋全都买了，这样就观景房屋未完成，字母默认。车辆升级 ，Day Trip 还有3星不停。Japan Drift Club。探索。箱根七区，还有很多地方没去过。中央火车站，这边还有介绍哎，原来日英双国籍。喝杯水去。 扭蛋之城电台。嘎嚓。科罗拉多站，科罗拉多站是2吗？还是1呀？公路竞速，越野竞速。万代赛事，反而码头的压力赛居然是最难的，后面的很轻松都3星了，只有这个码头压力赛没有。传奇。秋季、冬季、春季、吉祥物派对。
ほとんど日本に住んでるよ。
我靠，这 HDR 一搞，这前面的山都看不见，有点离谱。我降到30。这样能看到一点。不行，这截图出来的也差太多了吧，大哥了。What the hell？ 完全不是一回事儿啊！这样才差不多。
してる家は一体いくつになったの？日記をチェックしておいて。
子买了又不能进去，有一种买了根本就没有任何用的美，我只能说，是真没有用。おかえりなさい。
How do you go from this to this? Without
么2次在一个地方 ？shit。
Having to study interior design or break the bank. Making a space look good is a skill, but like most skills in life, it often doesn't come naturally at first. For the past few months, I've been stuck at home a lot more due to some medical issues, but in my boredom, I stumbled across a YouTube channel called Open Space. And basically with every video I watched, all I could think was, why do these places just look so good? But the more I looked for answers, the more I started paying it. And basically with every video I watched, all I could think was, why do these places just look so good? But the more I looked for answers, the more I started paying attention to other spaces as well. Apartments, coffee shops, and even showrooms. I always used to think that the only way to make a space look good was to either throw money at it or get an interior designer. But nowadays, you can actually get very far on your own. So whether you're moving into a new space or you're looking at just upgrading your current one, I think I might have a little bit of advice. After spending the past few months diving more into the world of interior design, these are 4 of the big things you can do to make your space look great. So without further ado, let's get into it. Number 1, pick a style. This is probably the easiest and quickest way to make any space feel more aesthetic. Before you buy something or move something or change anything, just first decide what do you actually want this space to feel like. Most of us, when we decorate, we tend to do it in the same way we would sort of get dressed when we're in a rush. We sort of just grab for anything that looks sort of okay. A random desk here, a chair there, maybe a print you saw online, but then put it all together and it all just feels a bit random because it is. Picking a style fixes that. It gives the whole space a kind of shared language that makes it easier to decide what belongs and what doesn't. Plus, you don't need to go deep into interior design theory. You just need a direction. So I want to highlight 3 styles in particular that have become quite popular over the past few years and that are generally kind of hard to mess up and will give you a very strong aesthetic result, or at the very least a decent base that you can sort of personalize and customize going forward. And what's nice about these styles is chances are high you already have things that fit into these styles, and if you don't, it's usually not that expensive to fill the gap. First up is mid-century modern, and it is probably the most accessible of the 3. This often also comes with earthy accents like burnt orange or olive green against a pretty neutral base. It feels very timeless because it draws on natural materials and proportions that our brains just kind of feel very comfortable with. And if your space already has any wooden furniture or warm tones, you're probably closer to this than you think. Then there's what I loosely call the modern tech aesthetic. If you spend any time on setup channels or gaming content, you already know exactly what this looks like. White everything, clean surfaces, and when done well, it looks crisp and almost futuristic. The trap is that the lighting can tip very easily from accent into overwhelming. You want to try and stick to pretty neutral lighting in general. And thirdly, there's Japandi. It's a blend of Japanese and Scandinavian design, and honestly, it might be the most forgiving style on this list because its whole philosophy is basically about doing less. Natural materials, muted tones, intentional empty space. Where mid-century modern has warmth and character, Japandi is a lot quieter. It has a bit of a cooler palette, some lighter woods like ash or pine, and generally just makes use of a lot of natural linen textures. The Japanese side of it brings in this idea that empty space isn't something that you have to fill, it's actually part of the design. And if your instinct is to keep things minimal, this is probably your direction to go. Each of these styles are essentially just a set of rules, and counterintuitively, I think it actually gives you a little bit more freedom because it makes it much easier to figure out what fits and what doesn't. So when you're looking at a piece and thinking, should I get this or should I add this to the space, you can kind of look at the little set of rules that come with your style and then very easily decide, yes, this can go in, or no, let's rather pass on this. And you don't even have to stick to just one. There are great examples out there of people blending these styles to pretty great effect. Personally, my space leans a bit more into a mix of Japandi and mid-century modern with a few black accents as well that I've kind of gotten more from the tech space. So you can blend it in a way that fits your personal taste. But just sort of pick a direction, even if it's just loosely, and you'll see a big difference from the get-go. Next up is color. A while back I made a video on how to take photos that don't suck, where I spoke about how when it comes to color, you really want to try and keep it simple in the sense of not having a bunch of colors going all at once. Your first tone is often your dominant tone. Usually it's determined by your biggest surfaces like your walls, your floors, or your large furniture in that space. Then a secondary tone usually comes through in smaller furniture and textiles, and finally one or two accent tones, which often pairs up with your decor pieces. As for which exact tones to go for, you can actually find a lot of inspiration on a website like Coolers that offers simplified and cohesive color palettes. Personally, I tend to rotate between light and dark browns as my dominant tones, with grey and black often coming in as secondary tones, and then accented by bits of red, white, and sometimes even a tiny bit of green. Every piece either sits within that palette or earns its place as a deliberate accent. Some palettes I've also come across that I think look really good include green, brown, and beige, as well as a white and orange combo. And often when it comes to colors, if you're looking at your space and it just doesn't quite feel right, look for the things that are kind of sitting on their own. Usually there's just one or two objects with the color that doesn't fit the rest of the palette that ends up doing most of the damage, and often just removing them or getting it in a different color actually sort of fixes the whole problem entirely. But once you've picked your style and you've picked your color palette, you now need to figure out how to make it personalized, because otherwise it looks good but otherwise a bit impersonal and maybe even boring. It still has to feel like it's your space, like it's a lived-in area. Which brings us to point number 3, personality. A golden skull sitting on top of a stack of Brandon Sanderson novels, a small collection of Porsche paraphernalia, a nostalgic trading card accenting a vintage globe. These are all examples of personality pieces, specifically my personality pieces. Personality pieces are pieces of decor or just things in general within a space that make it feel a bit more lived in, like someone actually inhabits this space, as opposed to just being some kind of sterile show. Personality comes from the unique objects you choose to display, but also how you choose to display them. These are often not the most premium interior design pieces. Sometimes they are literally just printed photos, but they're things that you generally care about, and these are items that have stories and meaning behind them. But when it comes to these personality pieces, it can be a slippery slope from some kind of decor that's interesting and just general clutter. And so what's often important in this regard is how you choose to display it. A book just thrown on your desk is clutter. 4 books stacked on top of each other with a sculptural object on top, and that's a display piece. So here are a few rules that make this easier. First, group things in odd numbers. 3s and 5s feel more natural to the eye than 2s and 4s. Next, vary the height within a grouping. So something flat, a mid-height object, and something taller than the rest. That variation creates a visual intrigue and depth. And lastly, make sure at least some of what you display actually means something to you. It should feel unique and really to your taste. If someone walked into your space and they couldn't tell anything about you based on what they saw, then that's maybe something to think about. But as much as you want a space to look good and you want a space to look like it's yours, you do also want that space to work for you, which brings me to the 4th and final point, functionality. And this is ultimately what is going to separate a space that just looks good on camera to a space that actually works in your day-to-day life. So ideally everything in your space should either look good or it should serve a purpose, but ideally You want it to do both. If you start finding things that do neither, that is going to cause your space to fall apart pretty quickly. That's generally why I'm quite picky when it comes to a lot of the tech I use. Yes, it should do what it's designed for, but it should also look good and it should add to the beauty of the space. I also find that it's just much more enjoyable to use items that have a good blend of functionality and aesthetics. Shelves and storage items are also great examples of this. It provides a functional solution to the problem of where do I put my stuff, but it can also be good looking in and of itself and actually complement the items that you are trying to store or display. There's a very big difference between a space that continues to look good as you work in it or live in it compared to a space that looks good when you've tidied it up, but once you actually start trying to do things in that space, it quickly just becomes cluttered and messy again. So think about your space in terms of friction. What do you use every day, and is it actually easy to get to? What's creating visual noise that you've just learned to kind of tune out? Look at things like cable storage and creating a home for random use items as opposed to having a bunch of cables and items that just sort of randomly float around. Generally speaking, every object in a space should earn its place there. If you find that you constantly have things that are just getting in the way and that maybe don't even look good in the first place, maybe they're just taking up room and you can put them somewhere else. So to bring it all together, how do you make a space look good? Well, pick a style and let it filter every other decision. Keep the color palette simple so that the things that matter actually have room to breathe, and fill it with objects that actually mean something to you. But at the end of the day, make sure everything in the space is earning its place. And I think you might find that your space turns into a place that you actually want to be in much more than usual. But with all that being said, I hope you enjoyed. See you in the next one. Cheers. Maybe the old times were better, where there'd be minimal car interiors, millennial grey apartments, or chairs that looked like a pile of sticks. I kind of get when people say they don't make them like they used to. I recently went to go view some vintage Porsches in Cape Town and was completely blown away by just how much style was involved with every aspect of these cars. So afterward, I went online to look at Porsche's modern heritage-inspired lineup, and again, I couldn't help but notice just how much character and personality these cars seem to have compared to their standard counterparts. But the more I started looking around, the more I noticed just how much style vintage items carried. There was this recurring pattern of just so much more detail, color, and texture in everything, which on paper makes no sense because nowadays we have better tools, better materials, and more data. So logically, modern design should be unbeatable, but instead a lot of it feels sterile, forgettable, soulless. And this isn't just nostalgia speaking, don't get me wrong, a lot of old things were uncomfortable, inefficient, and just not all that well engineered. Plus, a lot of my favorite vintage items existed before I did. But there's no denying that visually something went missing over the years. So what gives? Why do old things just look better? Part 1. Designed by humans. So back in the day, design teams used to be considerably smaller than they were today. A lot of iconic design came from surprisingly small teams. Sometimes it was just one designer, and because of that, there were fewer voices in the room telling them what not to do. It was a lot easier for a designer to get to a point where they thought something looked good and just sort of running with it. And because there were less committees and less feedback, a lot more of these designs surviving. Little quirks, odd proportions,
就是说如果我
shapes that
玩
might
游
not
戏
be
的话，我
as
就
easily
顺手
improved
开，
by a design team today.
所以没有固
Most
定
things
时间，
today are shaped by many layers of input. Designers, marketing
也不
teams,
是专
product
门的直
managers,
播，
brand
只是
guidelines,
觉得不
data
播白
user
不
testing.
播
Each
的一种
layer adds friction and smooths
心
out
理，
originality. But those quirks are
不
what
开白不
make
开。
vintage items interesting. When I look at a vintage Porsche interior, it doesn't feel optimized. It feels decided, like someone chose a direction and followed it through, even if it wasn't perfect, even if it wasn't for everyone. A lot of modern design tries to appeal to and sell to as many people as possible, and so what you end up with are designs that are quite reasonable and comfortable, and they accommodate a lot of different people and uses, but essentially what you end up with is something that, while liked by many people, ends up being very hard to remember. It's not all that interesting. And it's not that modern designers lack taste. If anything, they are incredibly skilled, but it's just that taste nowadays has to pass through so many filters that very little of it survives intact. Old objects often feel like the result of fewer filters, not better people, not smarter designers, just fewer steps between an idea and the actual final object. Vintage items weren't designed by committees, they were designed by individual designers who really paid attention to the details. Which brings us to the next idea. Part 2. Details matter. Take a good look at any well-made vintage item and you'll quickly start to notice the details. Back then, detail was a sign of care. Quality wasn't just about whether something worked, it was also about how it felt to own, to use, and to live with. If an object was worth building, it was often trusted as worth finishing properly. That extra effort wasn't always visible at first glance, but it was there, quietly doing its job. And the effect of that detail is something that we pick up on, even if it's just subconsciously. None of us are going to go out and count the amount of stitches on something or look at the exact grain of wood that was used. But especially when it comes to older items, they weigh a little bit differently, in the sense that when you see scratches or a bit of patina, it actually adds character. It doesn't necessarily detract from it. Modern design approaches detail very differently. In a world of mass production, tight margins, and fast turnaround times, detail is often treated as optional. Flat surfaces are cheaper to produce, uniform parts are easier to scale, complexity slows things down and raises costs, so it tends to disappear unless it serves a very clear function. That's why so many modern objects feel stripped back. Edges are sharper and more uniform, surfaces are smoother and emptier, and anything purely decorative is questioned or removed. None of this is necessarily bad, it's logical and it's efficient and often practical, but it changes how things come across. And that can be why it's hard to avoid this sort of feeling of cheapness when it comes to a lot of modern items. And it's not necessarily that they are made of bad quality, but you get this sense that there was no individual involved with the making of that product. There was no one that sort of went above what the minimum required was to get this item out, essentially for as cheaply as possible to sell for as high as possible. Older objects didn't just serve a purpose, they expressed craft, personality, and a certain pride in the act of making. That invisible layer of thought and decisions you don't immediately notice is what gives them this sense of weight and presence. It's subtle, but once you become aware of it, it's really hard to ignore, and it's something modern mass-produced objects rarely manage to replicate. Part number 3. Stylish colors. To rewind back to the Porsche 928 from the start of this video, one thing about this car that really stood out to me was its bold display of color, something that is abundant in older design. Bold blues, deep reds, rich greens, unexpected combinations that draw the eye and spark emotion. Color was used to make a statement back in the day. When it comes to color, there's more to it than just style. Color can make an object feel alive, give it character, and even convey intention. When a car is painted a deep red or a house interior has green walls, it doesn't feel accidental, it feels chosen. And that sense of choice matters. It tells you that at some point there was an individual involved who had a certain opinion on something and sort of just went through with it. Even if you see a color that you don't necessarily agree with or that you don't like, you still have to respect the fact that a color was chosen and a color was used, instead of just opting for something super neutral. Yet nowadays, everything from modern interiors to modern tech to modern cars all opt for the safe color beats. It's very rare for someone to come out with some kind of bold color and stick with it. I think it says a lot that one of the most exciting new car colors is a weird putty color, and that one of the biggest ways Apple managed to stand out with their new iPhone was just to make it orange. Back in the day, that willingness to choose and to commit and to accept that not everyone is going to agree with a certain design decision was a staple of vintage design, and I think that's why nowadays
我每次都错过这个
vintage
点。
items still have a lot of personality even all these years later, whereas a lot of new things like new cars and new tech, as much as it looks good now, it's only a matter of time before it looks completely outdated. And even now, things really struggle to keep a sense of personality about them, much less hold that over time. So in conclusion, why do old things look better? First up, they were designed by humans, not systems. 2, detail was treated as quality, not as optional. And 3, colors were used to express style, not to just go neutral. Taste, care, and risk. That is what gives all design so much soul. And yes, modern things are much more efficient than back in the day, but vintage items manage to hold on to something that our brains and our eyes really resonate with, which is a little bit of personality. It's design speaking to you in a language that modern items have somewhat forgotten. Cheers. How do you go from photos that look like this to photos that look like this? I always used to think that the only way to take nice photos was to have a nice camera with expensive lenses. But after 5 years of doing photography, I realized that pretty much all my favorite photos either came from my phone or a Sony camera from 4 years ago. But earlier this year, I went out with a friend of mine to shoot on an old film camera, and the whole process quickly reminded me that a good photo has much less to do with the tools you're using and much more to do with what you're looking for in a photo. I know a lot of people who go out of their way to buy a camera expecting it to magically make their photos better. Out with the old. How do you go from this out with the old and in with the old? There was a time where everyone was looking toward the future, but nowadays retro is more popular than ever. In 2023, more than 25 million rolls of photo film were sold around the world. In 2024, Fujifilm sold 15 million Instax instant cameras, and in 2025, vinyl records once again became $1 billion industry. But for me, one of the most interesting parts about this is that most of these buyers were people in their 20s, people who technically should have no nostalgia for anything before the 2000s, and yet they can't get enough of it. So what's going on here? Back in the 70s and 80s, style was everywhere, from fashion to architecture to cars. I mean, even 40 years after it came out, anyone can look at an old Porsche and go, that looks pretty cool. So aesthetically, they were really onto something back then, but unfortunately, time comes for all of us. So as aesthetically pleasing as vintage items were, they just don't hold up that well in the 21st century, either because they've stopped working or they've just deteriorated over time. And so that brings in retro items, essentially things that embrace the aesthetics of the older days with some modern underpinnings and conveniences, such as a point-and-shoot film camera with a digital shot display and a USB-C charging port, or a cassette player that looks straight out of 1979 but streams to your earbuds over Bluetooth. Or if you've got some extra coins to spend, you have a classic Alfa Romeo or Porsche 911 that can deliver all the aesthetic and driving pleasure in the world without feeling the need to break down after every few drives. So in today's episode, there are 3 things in particular that I want to have a look at. First, I want to have a look at where retro design actually comes from, why it looks so good, and importantly, why it continues to just be so popular. Oh, and a special mention to Veil Watchers who are sponsoring this video, but we'll circle back to them a little bit later. For now, let's quickly...
这辆车太美丽了，我靠！这是极限竞速7的封面车来着吧？我记得应该是极限竞速7 Motorsport 7。当时发布会上还在台上拽了出来啊，亮相了一下，应该就是这辆。我太喜欢这辆车了，哇哦，太性感了！我靠，我买不起呀，怎么还？哎，我去，我怎么这么穷啊？现在已经 ，What the fuck， 连个这也买不起了，都怪那个房子。
get back vintage items has to do with how everything used to be a lot more analog back in the day. Screens were mostly limited to the home television, but the late 90s saw the steady and inevitable digitization of everything. And especially nowadays, you can't really go far without being faced with a digital screen of some sort. And especially going into the 2000s, a lot of design languages prioritized flat surfaces and sharper lines, which most people don't really associate with the idea of vintage, where texture and organic shapes typically dominate. So because of this, retro design tends to pull a lot from what I'm going to loosely call the pre-digital design era. And essentially, it's sort of any kind of design language that originated before the 1990s.
君がリストのトップでね、俺の作業場に向かってくれないか、頼むよ。
Because that's what most people associate with vintage. But you can also go too far the other way. What makes something too vintage to be reimagined as a retro item? And what I mean by this is that most retro design seems to come from the 1980s and the 1970s. If you have a look at what actually gets revived, it's the Sony Walkman from 1979. It's the Polaroid that shot instant film. Or it's that classic racing chronograph from the 1970s. But nobody is reissuing a 1959 Cadillac with the giant tail fins and 3 feet of chrome bumper. Nobody's really going out of their way to make a rotary phone you'd actually want on your desk, or a modern take on the big wood-paneled console TV that doubled as furniture. And a big reason for this is actually just functionality. As much as retro design is about how something used to look, the world of the 50s and the 60s is a world that just doesn't really exist anymore, just doesn't translate all that well into the 21st century. However, that's a bit different when it comes to the 70s and 80s. Something like a cassette player still works as a thing you can clip on and go. The Polaroid is still a fun way to capture everyday memories. Even something like an original 911 had a clean, simple shape that wasn't really tied to anything that expired. So 50 years later, it still just reads as a good-looking car, which is exactly why people keep rebuilding it. So things that are predominantly from the 70s and 80s tend to sit on the right side of the analog line, meaning they are old enough to look vintage, but they are clean and functional enough to still fit in a modern setting. Which brings me to today's sponsor, the watches. The watches make use of some of the best vintage design languages from the past centuries, from premium watches. Link down below. Part 2. Retroactive. Right, so this is my vintage Kodak camera that I found in a thrift store a few years ago, and something about a genuinely cool object is that it carries everything from its era, both the details that age beautifully and the ones that really get the wear and tear, the aging of the materials, the grime and rust from use and just being outside. Vintage doesn't necessarily mean good looking, it often just means old. But that's not really the case with retro. Retro items tend to look consistently good. And the reason for this is that they don't pull inspiration from just any old vintage items. They only pull from the best of the best. Think of it as an era's greatest hits, not the whole album. Somebody looks back across the entire decade, keeps the handful of details that still look incredible today, and quietly bins the rest, which is exactly why a good retro piece often ends up looking better than the originals it's borrowing from. We're seeing the past with its bad days edited out. A really good example of this comes from the world of resto mods, essentially old cars that get reinvented for the modern era, such as old Land Rover Defenders, Porsche 911s, Alfa Julias, but nobody is resto modding a vintage Toyota Corolla, not because the Corolla was a bad car, it just wasn't striking or interesting, which means retro design is not going to
这边还有一个支线任务线，悠仁汽修厂。
それからホライズンフェスティバルで U 字自動車を紹介できることを光栄に思います。それではヘレナ・マーストン。
もう一度読んでくれ。念のために。さあほら。
3回読んだから要約して話をするね。ヘレナはホライズンジャパンでファンにその優れたスキルを披露してほしがってる。そして5台の車でフェスティバル会場をパレードするらしい。簡単だね。
ああ、だけど選択肢が多すぎる。プロジェクトにぴったりの車があるんだ。 考えてる暇はない。行こう。
居然都拍过了。
そう来なくちゃ。ユージ、道案内して。まだ何から始めるか言ってないよね。
エレナが U 字自動車の最高のマシンを欲しがってるなら、まさにそれを届けるさ。手抜きはなしだ。どんな車も俺たちの手にかかれば特別なものになることを見せてやろう。最初のプロジェクトは俺自身の日産グロリアだ。豪華で快適を体現した車だが、スピードを出すためのものじゃない。ラジオでオーバスを聞きながらくつろぐための一台さ。
つまり快適そうにかつスピードも出せってこと？
そうさ、いいね。スピードに加えて快適さ、素晴らしい傾向。さあ、ついてきて案内するよ。
この中古の車が日産グロリア。オークションで競り落とした昔の車だ。中は豪華だぞ。あ、そうか。OK。運転してくれ。この車のアップグレードがわかるはずさ。
わかった？車は実際には話せないからね。ユージは音を聞いて感じて理解する。それが彼の才能だから走らせてみよう。
慎重に。ダメージはゼロ。
不能有损坏。Gloria Gran Turismo 1995。
フェスティバルのためにまっさらのままにしてくれ。仕事ぶりを見せるために過去にアップグレードが行われていない車に手を加える。これはタイヤを変えて基本的なメンテナンスをしているだけだ。パフォーマンスは同じ95。
现在就要慢慢开，不能有损坏。
大胆なトッピングをする。思いっきり走らせられる場所を見つけて、このマシンの限界を確かめよう。
豪華さはあったがスピードはもっと上げられそうだ。95年当時も今も V6 ターボは優雅に街を流すだけなら完璧だが、俺たちには物足りないな。もっと大きなスポーツターボの方が似合ってるかもしれない。このギア比では求めるスピードが得られないようだ。シンプルな変更だが影響力は大きい。もっと軽量のスポーツ用の駆動系が欲しいな。作業場にある。素材の強度は抜群だ。各部を軽量化すればさらにスピードを引き出せるだろう。方針は決まったぞ。完了だ。気が変わった。野心が足りない。レースターボでパワーアップしよう。ギアボックスを交換、ギア比を調整した。長い道路を見つけて最高速度を伸ばせるか見てみよ
う。いいね。さあ、テストドライバー、ユージの仕事を試す栄誉を得た。よし、乗ってみて。
还省一上了个7呀。
最高速と加速が劇的に変わっているはずだ。そこを重点的に調整したからな。V6 エンジンをレースターボでアップグレードした。これだけでも100馬力は上がるが、ピークパワーが来るのが遅くなるので4000回転まで回さなければ違いには気づかないかもしれない。だがトルクが増したことでシートに押し付けられる感覚を味わえるはずだ。
近くにスピードゾーンがあるから公式記録が測れるわ。ナビのルートに従って。道中のコーナリングには気をつけて。矢のように直進することに特化したセッティングだから。
よし、エンジンアップグレードはうまくいってる。4000回転の追加のトルクが効いて最高速度に素早く到達できてるな。
ターボのアップグレードもブーストがかかってからのグリップが抜群。ストック状態のマシンとドラッグレースをしたらぶっちぎりだね。
了して準備もできた。
あと4つ残ってる。時間はない。次のプロジェクトを見つけるぞ。急いで。
ユージ、あなた最高。電話をかけて特別な一品を手配するよ。
最高だ。快適さもあるし、予想以上のスピードだ。
下一站。
了解です。スティーブン、何をしたいですか？
这些海报真漂亮啊，做的。飞跃终点线。稍等。
刑事、次のパレードのプロジェクトは？
聞くけど、挑戦したいのか？俺は挑戦したい。だから、ラリーの伝説になった行動のレジェンダリーカーを持ってる人がいて、さらにそれをラリー仕様に。よし、これから車を取りに行こう。ついてきてくれ。迷子になるなよ。
经典跑车。
これはラッキーだ。フェスティバルに参加している友人が三菱ランサー F を持ってるんだが、標準仕様じゃない。標準がどうのって言ったのは覚えてるけど、これは本物現象特別版なんだこれ。だけど俺たちが集めているのはロード仕様だ。それをラリー仕様にするのは大変だけど、通常の良さは折り紙付きだ。
ユージ、君ならジェットスキーにすることだってできるだろうけど、私は真のコンペティションにアップグレードできることをホライズンで示すっていう考えが気に入ってるんだ。
怎么也没人提醒我一下？把所有人都撞出去了，靠！这，我前面挡得严严实实的。
車にダメージを与えずパフォーマンスを上げられるところはあまり多くなさそうだな。だが今回の狙いは行動で優れたものをコンペティション仕様にする。行動外でも良くする。
テストドライバーさん、さあそろそろ出番だよ。出発しよ
う。ラリーカーはさまざまな路面状況に対応しなきゃならない。アスファルト、砂利、ダート。
それじゃあこの車をオフロードに持ち込んでみようよ。性能を試さなきゃ。ごめんね、かなり跳ねるかも。
日本也有这种巨山，是吧？这个倒带是不是没用啊？哎，也可以，这可以倒带。不知道倒带有没有什么点数惩罚，可能有吧。 无所谓。I don't care。
見覚えがあるか？ラリー仕様にするために手間がかかっている。ラリーサスペンション、スポーツブレーキ、ラリータイヤも見つけたよ。ほら。
マフラーも？
確かめてみようか。
OK テストドライバーさん、腕前を見せてもらえますか。マップの目的地までラリースタイルでぶっ飛ばして。
おお、いいね。もう単なるロードカーじゃないな。エンジンのパワーが上がったのが音でわかるだろう。アンチラブがターボの回転を維持してくれているおかげで、必要な時にいつでもブースト圧が得られるんだ。
それにあの音も手に入れたしね。最高だろ。
ラリーカーへのアップグレード完了。パレードの準備は全て整ったわ。
さて、早くて快適な車になったラリーカーが揃ったわけだが、次はどうすればいいか。
ユージなら思いつくよ。私が先に思いついちゃうかも。どちらにしてもまたね。じゃあ。
アップグレードの成果をうまく引き出せていたな。ありがとう。
冲刺时间。在标志性的彩虹桥附近，去找找车吧。感觉在这一边。 新干线，我看。哇哦！ 停车场。
待って、これは同じ色。おじさんのフィガロと何もかも同じ。これおじさんの？どんな色だったかは覚えてる。フィガロの色は4色ある。四季を表してるの。
観光ルートにぴったりな車ね。上品よね。森の中の道をゆったり走ったり、街中のカフェ前に止めてお茶を飲んだりするのにぴったりの本物のレジャーカーだよ。
休闲车。东京塔亮灯的时候，其实是一种橙红色，不是它这种红色，它的颜色不对，人家不是这种。这边限速20，20是什么速度？20是这样的速度啊，现在都超了，20是这样的速度。这是20。 跑了，跑了。哎呦！出警！出警！互动。这是要干？哎，我靠，这是什么呀？人家玩的好好的，这是啥呀 ？The fuck is this？ 哎，怎么游戏崩溃了？我靠！你说这，哎，真是的。行吧，今天就玩到这儿，拜拜。我是服了。